He almost drove past her, a woman unconscious in a wheelchair, buried in snow, on a road where no one stops in winter. The former Navy SEAL didn't know her name, didn't know her past, but something told him this moment was a test. What he didn't know was that saving her would awaken his own buried trauma and unleash a danger still hunting her. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. A frozen road outside Denver disappeared beneath wind-driven snow, streetlights dimmed to ghosts, and the night pressed inward as if testing how much weight one man could carry before he finally stopped. Jack Carter drove the taxi the way he did most nights, slow enough to respect the ice, steady enough to keep his thoughts from running ahead of the headlights. The city had thinned behind him, replaced by long stretches of white silence where the radio crackled and died, and the engine's hum became the only proof that he was still moving forward. At 45, Jack had learned that motion was safer than stillness. Stillness gave memory too much room. The yellow winter jacket felt heavier tonight, not from snow, but from habit, from the way his shoulders never fully relaxed anymore, as if some part of him was still braced for impact. The beret rested low on his head, more out of ritual than necessity, a reminder of a life where purpose had been clear even when fear was constant. Now purpose arrived in fragments, a fare completed, a road survived, another night passed without the past breaking through completely. The German shepherd in the back seat lifted its head as the taxi slowed near a bend where the wind cut hardest. Jack felt that shift before he saw anything himself. He trusted the dog's instincts more than his own when the weather turned like this. The animal did not bark or whine, but the air inside the cab changed, charged with attention, and Jack's pulse followed. He eased off the accelerator, scanning the road ahead through streaks of snow that blurred distance and depth into guesswork. That was when the shape emerged, wrong and unmoving against the white, too still to be debris, too human to ignore. Jack's foot found the brake without conscious thought, the taxi skidding slightly before stopping short of the figure half buried near the shoulder. For a moment, Jack did not move. He had learned that hesitation could be deadly, but so could rushing in blind. The storm pressed against the windshield, rattling like fingers impatient for entry, and Jack's mind flashed back to other nights when white landscapes had swallowed sound and certainty alike. He tasted metal at the back of his throat, the old warning sign, and forced himself to breathe through it. The dog shifted again, urgency now unmistakable, and that decided it. Jack grabbed his gloves and stepped out into the cold that bit immediately, sharp enough to punish hesitation. The girl lay on her side, partially covered in snow, her wheelchair overturned a few feet away like an afterthought the storm had already begun to erase. Her face was pale, lips tinged blue, lashes clotted with ice. Jack dropped to one knee, brushing snow from her cheek, calling out to her in a voice he kept calm by discipline, alone. No response. He checked her breathing, shallow but present, and felt a wave of relief crash into guilt, because relief had become something he rationed carefully. The dog stood close, body angled between Jack and the dark, as if the night itself were an adversary that might strike if given the chance. Jack lifted the girl with controlled care, every movement deliberate, aware of how easily pain could be added to an already broken body, and carried her back to the cab as the wind clawed at his balance. Inside the taxi, warmth fought the cold inch by inch. Jack laid the girl across the seat, adjusting her so she could breathe more easily, and the dog settled nearby, watchful but steady, a silent promise that she was not alone now. Jack's hands trembled once before he forced them still. He hated that tremor. It reminded him that no matter how many years passed, the body remembered what the mind tried to forget. He pulled the taxi back onto the road, turning the heater higher, glancing at the girl every few seconds, as if looking away too long might undo the fragile progress he'd made. As he drove, Jack felt the familiar internal tug-of-war begin. Part of him wanted to focus on logistics, nearest hospital, road conditions, response times. Another part whispered darker questions he did not welcome. What if he was too late anyway? What if stopping only delayed the inevitable? What if surviving again came with a cost he was no longer sure he could afford? He clenched his jaw, forcing those thoughts into the background. He had survived worse nights than this, he told himself, even if survival had never felt like a victory afterward. The girl stirred once, a faint sound escaping her throat, and Jack leaned closer, speaking softly, anchoring her to the present with simple facts. She was warm, she was safe, help was coming. He did not know if she heard him, but saying the words mattered. They mattered because once, long ago, he had needed someone to say them to him, and no one had been there to do it. The dog's attention shifted to the girl, its presence calming, protective without being possessive, and Jack felt an unexpected ache at the sight. Loyalty like that did not question worthiness, it simply stayed. The storm intensified as they climbed toward higher ground, visibility shrinking until the world seemed reduced to the length of the headlights. Jack's thoughts drifted, uninvited, to a winter years ago, to laughter carried away by wind, to a choice that had seemed small at the time and had changed everything. He pushed the memory down hard. This was not that night. This was not that road. Repeating those facts became a mantra as much as a reminder. The dog's steady breathing helped, a rhythm that cut through the static in Jack's head. When Jack finally saw the outline of the cabin ahead, half hidden by trees and snow, a tightness he hadn't acknowledged loosened slightly in his chest. He did not think of it as home, not anymore, but it was shelter, and shelter was enough for now. He parked as close as he could, hazards flashing uselessly into the white, and moved quickly, carrying the girl inside, while the winter night tightened around Denver's outskirts as the storm chased the taxi's headlights, turning every snowflake into a sharp white needle, and every mile into a quiet test of nerve and breath. Jack Carter kept both hands on the wheel, like the steering column was the only steady thing left in a world that loved to tilt without warning, and the woman in the passenger seat made the cab feel smaller than it had ever been, not because she took up space, but because her silence carried the weight of someone who had already said goodbye to herself long before the snow tried to finish the job. Jack Carter's clear lens glasses caught the dashboard glow, and for a moment the reflection looked like distant tracer fire, the kind that used to arrive with purpose and now arrived as memory dressed up as light. Jack Carter swallowed hard and forced attention back to the road, because attention was the difference between a safe turn and a skid, between a rescue and another name added to the list Jack Carter pretended not to keep. The German shepherd in the back seat did not whine or pace, but Jack Carter felt the dog's awareness like a second set of eyes measuring every tremor in the cab, every shift in tone, every breath the woman took, as if the dog understood what Jack Carter understood. Danger was not always a man with a weapon. Sometimes danger was a person deciding they were not worth saving. The woman stirred with a faint jerk, the kind that happens when pain and cold negotiate for control, and Jack Carter's chest tightened instantly, a reflex older than retirement, older than taxi work, older than the promise Jack Carter once made to himself that civilian life would be quieter. Quiet, Jack Carter had learned, could be loud in its own way. Her eyelids fluttered open, unfocused at first, then sharpening with alarm as she realized she was not on the snow anymore, not alone, not sliding toward a dark that would not care whether she fought or surrendered. Her hand moved as if to push herself away from the seat, and Jack Carter didn't reach for her, didn't crowd her, didn't try to hold her still, because Jack Carter had seen what panic did when it met restraint. Instead, Jack Carter softened his voice, keeping it low and steady, telling her she was safe, telling her the heater was on, telling her the road was bad, but the cab was moving, telling her that if she could breathe in and out, slowly, the worst part had already passed. She looked at Jack Carter as if searching for the hook behind the kindness, the hidden cost, the reason a stranger would stop, and Jack Carter felt that look land on old bruises that never showed on skin. The bruises of being useful only when needed, of being praised only for performance, of being loved only until the waiting became inconvenient. She asked where he was taking her, and Jack Carter gave the honest answer that Jack Carter didn't know yet, only that leaving her on the road was not an option Jack Carter could live with, and the woman's mouth twitched like she wanted to laugh at the absurdity of being offered life by a man who sounded like he wasn't fully convinced life was generous. The woman's voice came out thin and raw, and she said, "The world doesn't have a place for me anymore." And Jack Carter felt something inside him recoil, not from her words, but from how familiar they sounded in the private chambers of his own mind, on nights when the walls of his rented room felt too close and the air felt borrowed. She didn't cry at first. She said it as if reporting weather, as if despair were simply another forecast. Then she added, harsher, almost mocking herself, "I'm a cripple who lives off family." And Jack Carter gripped the wheel until his knuckles ached, because the sentence did not belong to her, not truly, it belonged to the people who had taught her to repeat it. Jack Carter asked her name, and she answered Emily Harper, then swallowed hard, as if her name had become an accusation rather than an identity. Jack Carter did not ask about the chair or the accident, not yet, because Jack Carter knew how trauma hated interrogation, and because Jack Carter was fighting his own internal noise, the sudden flash of a whiteout in another life, the sound of wind over radio static, the taste of fear that arrived without permission. Emily Harper stared out at the swirling snow and said she had been thrown out by her stepfather, and the word stepfather came with no warmth, only the cold practicality of naming the person who had ended her shelter. Jack Carter felt the familiar anger rise, the kind that used to sharpen into action on missions, the kind that now had nowhere clean to go. Anger, Jack Carter had learned, could keep you alive, but it could also burn you out if you fed it without purpose. Emily Harper's mother had died in an accident, Emily Harper said, and after that, the man who married into the family used the guardianship paperwork like a weapon, taking what the mother had left behind, shifting accounts, signing forms, turning legality into theft so polished it looked like law. Emily Harper said she tried to fight, but fighting required money, and money was the very thing that had been siphoned away. Emily Harper said she tried to endure, but endurance required a place to sleep, and that place had been revoked the moment her existence became inconvenient. Jack Carter listened, and the silence in the cab grew heavy, not awkward, but charged. The way silence grows heavy right before someone makes a decision they cannot unmake. Jack Carter wanted to say something righteous, something heroic, something that would rewrite her pain into a neat lesson. But Jack Carter had learned that neat lessons were for people who didn't have to wake up with consequences. Instead, Jack Carter said carefully, "You are not a burden." And then, because he could not stop himself from naming what he heard, he added, "You were targeted." Emily Harper turned toward him sharply, suspicion flaring, as if being seen clearly were its own kind of threat, and Jack Carter felt the dog's attention shift too, like a silent agreement that truth mattered here. Jack Carter explained, not like a sermon, but like a man laying tools on a table, someone who steals through paperwork, counts on shame to keep the victim quiet, counts on exhaustion to make the victim disappear, counts on winter to do what violence might attract attention for. Jack Carter didn't mention all the ways Jack Carter had seen people vanish when the world decided they were expendable, but the memory sat behind his words like a shadow. Emily Harper's jaw trembled, and at last the tears came, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, as if her body had been holding them back for days, maybe years. And now the warmth of the cab and the steady pressure of a stranger's attention gave her permission to release what she'd been forced to swallow. Jack Carter felt his throat tighten with an old reflex to fix things fast, to end the crying, to restore control. But he resisted, because control wasn't healing, and speed wasn't kindness. Jack Carter let her cry while he drove, let the heater hum, let the road unfurl, and in that small choice he felt a strange shift inside himself, like a knot loosening by a fraction. The PTSD made Jack Carter hyper-aware of everything, and that meant Jack Carter caught the small details that mattered. Emily Harper flinched at certain sounds like they were footsteps behind a door. Emily Harper kept glancing at the side mirror like expecting headlights to appear. Emily Harper's hands clenched, as if she feared being taken rather than saved. Jack Carter asked if her stepfather knew where she was going, and Emily Harper shook her head, then hesitated, then admitted that she wasn't sure because the man had eyes in places she didn't understand, and because legal control had made him feel untouchable for so long that he might believe he could reach anywhere. Jack Carter's pulse quickened, not with panic, but with recognition. Threats were rarely loud at first. They were quiet and persistent, like winter itself. Jack Carter chose his next words with care and told Emily Harper that Jack Carter would not drop her off at a shelter door and vanish into the night. Not yet. Not until Emily Harper could stand a chance. Jack Carter heard himself say it and felt the internal recoil, because promises frightened him now. Promises had once been the start of losing. Promises had once been the reason he came home to an empty life. And still, he made one anyway. Emily Harper stared at him as if he had offered something impossible, and she whispered, "Why?" And Jack Carter almost told her the truth, that leaving her would have meant abandoning a part of himself he'd been trying to bury, that saving her might be the only way Jack Carter could save the version of Jack Carter that still believed. Showing up mattered, but instead Jack Carter said, simpler, "Because you were out there." The dog shifted, settling in a way that felt like approval, and Jack Carter caught that in the mirror and felt a brief, unfamiliar warmth. Not happiness, not peace, but the first hint that maybe the night didn't get to decide everything. Ahead, the storm thickened again, and Jack Carter signaled off the main road toward a darker stretch that led away from town lights, a route Jack Carter knew well, and Emily Harper's breathing changed as she realized they were leaving the familiar grid behind. Jack Carter kept his voice calm and told her there was a cabin, old and quiet, a place to get warm and reassess, and as he said the word cabin, a hard flicker moved behind Jack Carter's eyes, the kind of flicker that came when memory and weather collided, but Jack Carter pushed it down and drove on, because the road was narrowing and the snow was rising, and somewhere in the dark, the next chapter of their survival was already waiting at a door that hadn't been opened in too long. The old cabin waited at the forest's edge as the storm thickened, its single window glowing weakly against the snow, a fragile promise of warmth that felt both distant and necessary. Jack Carter parked the taxi with deliberate care, the tires crunching into a silence that felt heavier than the road they'd left. And for a moment Jack Carter stayed still, listening to the wind batter the walls like a reminder that shelter was never guaranteed, only chosen. Emily Harper sat rigid in the passenger seat, hands clenched, eyes scanning the dark, as if the night might reclaim her if she moved too quickly, and Jack Carter recognized that look because Jack Carter had worn it himself in safer places that still felt hostile, the look of someone waiting for the price to be named. Jack Carter opened the door, letting the cold rush in like an accusation, then steadied Emily Harper as she was guided inside, not lifting, not forcing, just offering balance in a way that preserved her dignity, because dignity was the one thing the storm had not yet stolen from her. The cabin's door closed with a hollow thud that sounded final and intimate at the same time, and Jack Carter felt a flicker of old unease rise in his chest, the memory of other doors closing far from home. But he pushed it down and moved with purpose, lighting the lamp, stacking wood, coaxing the stove, until the first hesitant warmth began to spread. Emily Harper watched every movement, as if cataloging escape routes, while the dog settled into a quiet vigilance, attention stretched thin across the room, alert to shifts in breath and tone, loyal in a way that did not demand reassurance, only presence. Jack Carter noticed the empty shelves, the bare pantry, the medicine cabinet that held nothing useful, and a familiar calculation took over, the kind that measured risk against necessity without drama. Jack Carter felt the old discipline lock in, but without the edge of command, only the clarity of responsibility. Emily Harper whispered that she would be fine, that she did not need anything, that she would not stay long, and Jack Carter heard the lie not as deception, but as armor, the kind people forge when they have learned that needing can be punished. Jack Carter did not argue. Jack Carter simply said he would be back and pulled on his coat again, because leaving was not abandonment if it came with return, and because the storm did not get to decide whether they prepared or not. Outside, the wind clawed at Jack Carter's balance as the taxi nosed back onto the road, headlights swallowed by snow that felt personal in its persistence, and Jack Carter's mind began to crowd with images he did not invite. A white horizon dissolving into chaos, the sound of metal under stress, a voice calling his name that had not existed in years. Jack Carter breathed through it, counting the seconds between inhales like he used to count steps on unfamiliar ground, reminding himself that this road was not that road, that tonight had a different purpose. At the store, fluorescent light hummed like a reprimand, and Jack Carter moved quickly, gathering what the cabin lacked: bandages and antiseptic, pain relievers and heat packs, canned food and bread, then paused, thinking of the wheelchair left outside the cabin door, its damage a quiet threat, and added tools and parts with the care of someone who understood that small failures could cascade into disaster. Back into the storm, Jack Carter felt time stretch, each mile a test of patience and restraint, the urge to drive faster fighting the knowledge that speed was the enemy on ice, and beneath it all, a deeper fear stirred, irrational and sharp, that the cabin might not be there when he returned, that warmth could vanish as easily as it appeared. When the lights finally re-emerged through the snow, Jack Carter exhaled a breath he had not realized he was holding, and hurried inside, stamping cold from his boots, setting supplies down like offerings on a table that had waited too long. Emily Harper was where he'd left her, wrapped in a blanket, eyes following him with a mix of relief and something more cautious, and the dog's attention softened a fraction, the kind of shift that marked trust, earned by consistency rather than words. Jack Carter worked without ceremony, cleaning Emily Harper's scraped hands, taping bruises with practiced gentleness, explaining each step before he did it, because control returned faster when it was shared, and Emily Harper listened, shoulders easing as the pain dulled and the warmth settled deeper. When Jack Carter stepped outside again to the wheelchair, the storm seemed to lean in, curious, and Jack Carter felt a familiar focus narrow his world to metal and sound, to bolts and tension, to the satisfaction of alignment restored. Fixing things had always been easier than fixing people, but tonight the act felt connected, as if restoring the chair's integrity might restore something else as well. Emily Harper watched from the doorway, saying nothing, absorbing the sight of a man kneeling in the snow, choosing effort over comfort without being asked. And something shifted inside her, a thought she had been resisting, that staying might not mean taking, that accepting help could be a form of work too. Inside again, the fire caught properly at last, flame steady and unapologetic, and the room changed from a place of survival to a place of possibility, however fragile. Jack Carter sat across from Emily Harper, not too close, and the quiet between them felt earned rather than empty. Emily Harper asked why Jack Carter knew how to do all of this, and Jack Carter answered with a truth stripped of detail that there were lives where preparation was the only mercy available. And Emily Harper nodded, as if recognizing a language she had been learning without instruction. The dog settled into stillness that spoke of relief, the kind that comes when the pack is intact for the night. And Jack Carter felt the strange comfort of that word settle in his chest. Pack, a thing he had lost and perhaps found again without naming it. As the storm continued to grind against the walls, Jack Carter noticed Emily Harper's gaze lingering on the repaired chair, on the supplies laid out neatly, on the fire that refused to die, and he sensed the question forming before she asked it, the question of how long she could stay, of what the cost would be, of whether safety always came with strings. Jack Carter chose not to answer yet, because answers sometimes closed doors, and instead said that tomorrow they would see how she felt, that healing had its own schedule, and that for tonight staying was not a failure. Emily Harper nodded slowly, the words landing with more weight than she expected, and as she closed her eyes at last, the storm's voice seemed to recede, leaving behind a quieter tension that hinted at the conflicts waiting beyond the cabin walls, the kind that did not blow through and move on, but returned with intent. Morning crept into the cabin as pale winter light filtered through frost-laced glass, revealing a stillness that felt provisional, as if the day itself were waiting to see who would claim it. Jack Carter woke before the stove settled into warmth, a habit left over from years when dawn was less a promise than a deadline, and for a moment Jack Carter lay still, listening for sounds that might signal trouble, a footstep where none should be, a breath too close, the old vigilance sharpening without permission. The woman's presence in the next room shifted that vigilance into something unfamiliar, a responsibility that did not come with rank or orders, and Jack Carter found that unsettling in a way that felt honest. Emily Harper was awake too, sitting upright near the fire, posture careful, eyes fixed on the doorway, as if she were already halfway gone, and Jack Carter recognized the calculation running behind that gaze, the tally of favors and debts that survivors kept like ledgers etched into bone. Emily Harper spoke first, voice steady but brittle, saying she would leave as soon as the road cleared, saying she had already stayed too long, saying she would not become another weight Jack Carter had to carry, and Jack Carter felt the words strike a nerve he hadn't realized was exposed, because he had carried weights most of his life, and none of them had ever asked permission. Jack Carter told Emily Harper that leaving today would be a mistake, not as a command, but as a statement of probability, because healing did not respect pride, and storms did not negotiate with resolve. And Emily Harper shook her head, anger flaring briefly, not at Jack Carter, but at the idea of being protected without purpose. She said she would not stay to be pitied, would not trade one form of dependence for another. And Jack Carter heard in her refusal the same defiance that had once kept him alive and later kept him alone. Jack Carter searched for the right response and found that reassurance would sound like dismissal, so instead he offered structure, the kind that had saved him more than once when emotions ran hot and clarity ran thin. Jack Carter said there would be no free shelter, no charity disguised as kindness, that if Emily Harper stayed, she would work, not because she owed him, but because work gave shape to days that otherwise collapsed into waiting. And Emily Harper's eyes narrowed with suspicion until Jack Carter explained the terms plainly, that there were things she could do without strain, keeping the place in order, preparing meals, tasks that mattered precisely because they were small and repeated, and that Jack Carter would pay her by the day, fair and clean, no favors implied. Emily Harper absorbed this in silence, weighing the offer like a fragile object that might shatter if mishandled, and Jack Carter waited, resisting the urge to fill the space, because he had learned that people needed room to decide who they were going to be next. The dogs Presence grounded the moment, a steady calm that seemed to say the pact did not fracture over negotiation. It adapted, and Jack Carter felt that steadiness ease something tight behind his ribs. Emily Harper agreed at last, not with relief, but with a cautious nod that signaled terms accepted rather than mercy received, and Jack Carter respected that distinction more than he expected. The day unfolded with a rhythm that surprised them both, Jack Carter leaving for his taxi shift once the roads were passable, the act of stepping back into the driver's seat feeling different, now that returning meant something other than an empty room. As Jack Carter drove, the city slid by in gray and white, and the familiar triggers flickered at the edges of his vision, sudden movements, horns cutting too close, a plume of snow kicked up like smoke. But there was a counterweight now, the image of a fire tended and a space kept, and Jack Carter found that the intrusive thoughts lost a fraction of their force when he could name a reason to come back intact. Emily Harper moved through the cabin slowly, testing each task like a muscle long unused, discovering that usefulness did not have to announce itself to be real, and with each small completion, a quiet steadiness settled in her chest where panic had lived. When Jack Carter returned that evening, tired but present, the cabin carried a different air, not transformed, not healed, but held. And Jack Carter felt a cautious satisfaction that did not tip into hope, because hope, he knew, had to be earned in increments. They spoke little over dinner, not out of distance, but out of respect for the day's wait. And Jack Carter noticed that Emily Harper ate without the hurry of someone preparing to be asked to leave, a subtle shift that mattered more than any speech. As night deepened, Emily Harper hesitated, then said she would leave in the morning once she felt stronger, testing the boundary again as if expecting it to snap, and Jack Carter answered evenly that strength was not a switch, and that leaving because of fear of being useless would only replace one prison with another, words that surprised him as much as they surprised her, because he heard in them the echo of advice he had once needed and never received. Emily Harper bristled, pride flaring, then faltering, and Jack Carter saw the moment she understood that staying was not surrender if it came with agency, that being paid for honest work was not charity, but acknowledgement. The dog settled near the door, a quiet sentinel whose trust did not waver with arguments, and Jack Carter felt the strange relief of knowing someone else was keeping watch, not because they were ordered to, but because they chose to. Later, alone with his thoughts, Jack Carter felt the old ghosts stir, the memory of a life interrupted by weather and loss, and he wondered whether inviting someone into the fragile perimeter he'd built was reckless or necessary, a question he did not try to answer, because answers tended to arrive late and cost more than expected. Emily Harper lay awake too, staring at the ceiling, the offer replaying in her mind until its edges softened into something like possibility, and she realized with a start that the job was not the point. The point was that someone had trusted her to contribute rather than disappear. Outside, the wind rose again, not as fierce as before, but insistent, and both of them felt it as a reminder that the storm was not finished with the mountain, that forces beyond the cabin would test whatever fragile equilibrium they had begun to build. And as Jack Carter banked the fire and checked the door one last time, a distant rumble rolled through the dark, too deep to be thunder, too slow to ignore, a sound that hinted the land itself was shifting, patient and dangerous, preparing the ground for consequences neither of them could yet see. The cabin felt quieter that afternoon, the kind of quiet that settled only after routine had taken root, when movement no longer meant escape and stillness no longer meant danger. Jack Carter was gone on a long taxi shift, the weather clear enough to tempt the roads into false confidence, and Emily Harper moved through the cabin with measured care, cleaning not to impress, but to occupy her hands so her thoughts would not wander back to places she had sworn to leave behind. There was comfort in repetition, in wiping the same table Jack Carter ate at, in stacking firewood exactly where he always reached for it, in learning the shape of a space that did not recoil from her presence. And yet the cabin resisted becoming familiar too quickly, as if it were guarding something private. Emily Harper found it while dusting a narrow shelf near the back room, a stack of worn notebooks bound with frayed string, hidden not out of secrecy but out of habit, the kind of habit formed when a person no longer expects anyone to look closely. Emily Harper hesitated, the instinct to respect boundaries wrestling with a deeper pull, not curiosity for gossip, but a need to understand the man whose quiet discipline had become the axis of her fragile safety. And when she opened the first notebook, she realized immediately that this was not a place meant for strangers, but for survival. The pages were uneven, some stained, some written in hurried lines that slanted when emotion outran control. And Jack Carter's words carried the weight of a life lived in fragments, entries about missions reduced to impressions rather than details, about nights when sleep felt like betrayal, about the way winter soundlessly erased footprints. And as Emily Harper read, she felt an ache that was not envy or fear, but recognition, the recognition of someone who had also learned to catalog pain because letting it roam freely was too dangerous. The name that appeared again and again was Laura Carter, and the shift in tone when Jack Carter wrote it made Emily Harper pause because the sentences softened without losing their restraint, as if Jack Carter had only allowed himself tenderness on paper when no one could witness it. Laura had been his wife, not a footnote, but a center, and the entries that followed were not dramatic declarations of love, but ordinary moments preserved with care, shared jokes, arguments that ended in laughter, plans made casually because they seemed guaranteed. And Emily Harper felt the quiet cruelty of knowing how quickly guarantees could evaporate. Then the tone changed, the handwriting tightening, the sentences shortening, winter entering the pages not as a season, but as an event, a trip meant to repair distance, a sudden storm, a decision to keep going instead of turning back. And the entry that ended mid-page, the ink pressed hard enough to tear the paper, as if Jack Carter had stopped writing, not because he ran out of words, but because something else had taken them away. Emily Harper did not need the explicit account to understand what followed, because grief had a grammar of its own, and the later entries bore it clearly, days measured by survival rather than meaning. The guilt of being the one who walked out of the snow alive, the way memories replayed without mercy, the way the cabin became both refuge and punishment. A place Jack Carter returned to, not to heal, but to endure. Emily Harper closed the notebook slowly, her hands trembling, not from shock, but from the intimacy of realizing how much cruelty a person could carry without becoming cruel themselves. And she understood then that Jack Carter's restraint was not indifference, it was containment, a dam holding back a flood that never truly receded. The dog shifted near the doorway, sensing the emotional change, not intruding, only present. And Emily Harper felt the steadiness of that presence mirror her own resolve forming quietly beneath the ache. She thought of her own losses, of her mother's absence that had hollowed out the word home, of the stepfather who had used law as a weapon and called it responsibility, of how easily power justified itself when the victim was tired. And for the first time, Emily Harper saw her pain not as an isolated failure, but as part of a wider pattern of survival that crossed lives and circumstances. When Jack Carter returned at dusk, snow dusting his shoulders, Emily Harper was sitting at the table with the notebook stacked neatly beside her, not open, not hidden again, but acknowledged, and Jack Carter froze for a fraction of a second, the kind of freeze that came when a perimeter was breached, when something private was suddenly visible. Emily Harper did not apologize immediately, and that surprised Jack Carter more than an excuse would have, because her silence was not defiant, it was respectful. And when she spoke, she chose her words carefully, saying only that she understood now why winter felt different here, why the cabin held both warmth and warning, why Jack Carter watched the weather the way other people watch the news. Jack Carter sat slowly, the old instinct to shut down warring with a strange relief that someone else had seen the truth without flinching, and he admitted quietly that Laura had been taken by a storm they underestimated, that survival had felt like theft ever since, and that writing had been the only place Jack Carter allowed himself to speak freely because paper did not interrupt or pity. Emily Harper listened without trying to fix anything, because she knew now that some wounds closed only when they were allowed to be named, and she told Jack Carter that she did not want to leave anymore, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she believed staying could be an act of choosing rather than clinging. Jack Carter absorbed this, his expression unreadable, but something in his posture eased, as if the burden of guarding his past alone had lightened by degrees, and he warned her that the cabin was not a sanctuary from everything, that the world had a way of finding what it wanted to claim, a statement that landed heavier than it sounded. Emily Harper nodded, understanding more than he realized, because her stepfather had taught her how danger often arrived dressed as authority, and she felt a quiet determination settle in her chest, the determination not to run when the next test came. Outside, the mountain shifted again with a low, distant sound, snow sliding somewhere beyond sight, a reminder that winter was patient and that what was buried did not always stay buried. And as the fire crackled and the dog settled closer, Emily Harper felt certain of one thing she had not felt since before the accident, that staying here with this man and his unspoken grief might be the first deliberate step she had taken toward healing, even if it meant standing in the path of storms yet to come. The storm returned with brutal intent, swallowing the mountain road as dusk collapsed into a white, roaring wall that erased distance, memory, and mercy in equal measure. Jack Carter felt it before he saw it, the pressure shift that crawled under skin and into bone, the same instinct that once told him when a mission had turned wrong long before orders confirmed it. And as the taxi climbed the winding road back toward the cabin, Jack Carter's hands tightened on the wheel with a fear that was not abstract but personal, sharp and old. Every mile forward scraped at a memory Jack Carter tried to keep sealed, the memory of snow turning from backdrop to predator, of laughter turning into shouting, of a choice made too late, and the harder Jack Carter pushed those thoughts away, the louder they came back, because trauma did not respect willpower, it respected repetition. Inside the cab, the world narrowed to headlights and breath, and Jack Carter counted seconds again, grounding himself in the present because the past had teeth and tonight it wanted blood. At the cabin, Emily Harper had sensed the change hours earlier, not as a sound but as a weight in the air, the way the dog's attention sharpened and refused to settle, the way the silence outside felt crowded rather than empty. And when the knock came, it was not hesitant or polite. It was confident, practiced, the knock of someone who believed the law was on his side. Emily Harper knew without opening the door who stood there, because fear had taught her his rhythm, his certainty, the way authority could be worn like armor by someone who had never earned it. The stepfather did not plead, did not threaten openly. He spoke through the door with measured calm, saying her name like a claim, reminding her of guardianship, of unfinished paperwork, of problems that could be resolved quietly if she cooperated. And Emily Harper felt the familiar paralysis creep up her spine, the old training that said compliance was safer than resistance. The dog placed itself between Emily Harper and the door without command, a low warning vibrating through its body, not rage, but resolve, the memory of past protection surfacing as instinct, and Emily Harper drew strength from that presence, not because it promised victory, but because it refused abandonment. Outside, the storm intensified, wind driving snow sideways until the world lost edges, and somewhere above the cabin, the mountain groaned, a deep, resonant sound, like a warning spoken too late. Jack Carter heard that sound through the engine, and his heart stuttered, because it was the same sound he had ignored once before, the sound of mass deciding to move, and panic threatened to rip control away, as images of Laura flooded back uninvited, her laughter swallowed by wind, her hand slipping as footing vanished, the helpless knowledge that training did not matter when nature rewrote the rules. Jack Carter pushed the accelerator harder than caution advised, not out of recklessness but out of refusal, refusing to arrive late again, refusing to let the mountain claim another life while he survived to write about it. At the cabin, the stepfather's tone sharpened when Emily Harper did not respond, impatience cracking through his composure as he forced the door, legality giving way to intent. And in that moment, Emily Harper understood with terrifying clarity that this visit had never been about reconciliation, only erasure. She backed away, breath shallow, mind racing through limited options, and when the door burst inward, the dog lunged not with uncontrolled violence, but with precise ferocity born of purpose, intercepting the threat with everything it had, because loyalty for it was not an emotion, it was a function. The man shouted, stumbled, cursed, and chaos filled the small space as snow and cold rushed in. And above it all, the mountain made its decision, a thunderous crack rolling through the valley as snowpack broke free, gravity turning patience into inevitability. Jack Carter saw the collapse as he crested the final bend, a white wall moving with terrifying speed, and something inside him went still, the calm that arrived only when fear burned itself out and left clarity behind. Jack Carter abandoned the taxi without hesitation, boots hitting snow as he ran, lungs burning, mind stripped to a single directive: get there now. And as he ran, he felt the old pain tear open, not weakening him, but fueling him, the knowledge that survival meant nothing if it was solitary. Inside the cabin, the dog's struggle bought seconds that mattered, Emily Harper frozen between terror and resolve, until she heard Jack Carter's voice cut through the storm, raw and urgent, and the sound shattered her paralysis because it was real, because it meant someone had come back. Jack Carter burst through the door as the avalanche roared closer, time compressing into fragments, the dog disengaging instantly to clear space, the stepfather scrambling in panic as authority collapsed into animal fear, and Jack Carter crossed the room in 2 strides, wrapping Emily Harper in his arms with a grip that anchored rather than trapped, holding her the way he wished he had held Laura, not as protection promised, but as protection enacted. The first impact hit like a freight train, sound and force merging into a blinding violence that tore at walls and memory alike. And as the cabin began to give, Jack Carter braced them together, body turned into shield, by instinct, older than grief, while snow and darkness swallowed everything else, sealing the night around them and leaving only the unanswered question of who would emerge when the mountain finished speaking. Dawn broke slowly over a scarred mountainside, the storm finally spent, leaving silence, broken trees, and a cabin half buried in white, where the night had decided who would be spared. Jack Carter came back to consciousness in fragments, the world returning not as images but as pressure, cold, and the unmistakable weight of another human being held against his chest. And the first coherent thought that cut through the fog was not fear or pain, but the simple knowledge that Emily Harper was breathing, shallow but real, her body curled into his as if instinct had chosen him as shelter before the mind could argue otherwise. Jack Carter shifted carefully, every muscle screaming in protest, training overriding panic as he assessed damage with ruthless efficiency, the cabin reduced to a broken shell but not collapsed entirely, the avalanche slowed by trees and terrain just enough to leave pockets where life could cling, and in one of those pockets they had landed. Emily Harper stirred, coughing, the sound sharp and fragile, and Jack Carter felt a surge of relief so intense it bordered on disorientation, because relief was not an emotion he trusted anymore. Relief had a history of being temporary. He spoke her name once, low and steady, anchoring both of them to the moment, and when her fingers tightened weakly in his jacket, the gesture felt heavier than any oath Jack Carter had ever sworn. Nearby, the dog moved through the debris with singular focus, not frantic, not confused, but alert in the way of a guardian who understood the difference between chaos and conclusion, positioning itself between them and the ruined doorway as if the danger were not yet finished simply because the noise had stopped. Outside, muffled by snow and distance, voices began to carry, first indistinct, then clearer, the sound of rescue crews responding to reports of an avalanche and a disturbance, and Jack Carter felt the old reflex to prepare for extraction rise before he reminded himself that this time he was not leaving anyone behind. When the rescuers reached them, their presence was efficient and calm, professionals who had seen mountains make decisions before and respected the cost, and Emily Harper was stabilized and carried out with care, Jack Carter refusing to let go until hands replaced his and assured him she was secure, and even then the separation felt wrong, like releasing a lifeline too early. The stepfather was found alive, but injured some distance from the cabin, his authority stripped bare by circumstances he could not control, and the law that had once protected his theft now closed around him with equal indifference, guardianship turning from shield to evidence, intent made undeniable by force and timing. Jack Carter watched the man taken away with no satisfaction, only a dull certainty that consequences did not heal wounds. They merely stopped them from spreading further, and as Emily Harper was loaded into the ambulance, conscious now and insisting, through cracked lips that the dog bee brought with her, Jack Carter felt the tightness in his chest, ease just enough to allow breath again. The hospital days blurred together into a rhythm of checks and reassurances, the sterile calm of corridors contrasting sharply with the violence that had delivered them there. And Jack Carter found himself sitting at Emily Harper's bedside with a patience he had not known he still possessed, listening more than speaking, because recovery had taught him that survival often needed witnesses more than advice. Emily Harper learned that her stepfather's crimes unraveled quickly once exposed, years of quiet manipulation collapsing under scrutiny, and when the legal dust settled, the assets he had hoarded were seized and redirected by court order into charitable foundations, not returned to Emily Harper as restitution, but transformed into something that would not poison her future, with reminders of control, a decision she accepted with surprising peace because ownership had never been what she wanted, agency was. When she was discharged, weakened but resolute, Jack Carter brought her back not to the ruined cabin, but to a temporary place in town, a practical choice that felt strange in its normalcy, and yet, even there, the sense of togetherness followed, an invisible thread that did not fray when scenery changed. The dog adapted instantly, vigilant softened now by the knowledge that the immediate threat had passed, staying close without hovering, as if understanding that its role had shifted from defense to continuity, a living reminder that loyalty did not end when danger did. Jack Carter returned to driving his taxi, the routes familiar, the city unchanged, but something fundamental had altered in his internal landscape, the intrusive memories still present but less tyrannical, because when they surged he could counter them with a tangible present, a reason to come home, a person who did not require him to be fixed, only present. Emily Harper regained strength slowly, frustration flaring at times, then ebbing, but each step forward felt earned rather than borrowed, and when she spoke about the future, it was no longer framed as escape, but as intention, volunteering with the very organizations that now held the reclaimed funds, transforming her loss into a structure that might catch others before winter did. Jack Carter watched this with a quiet admiration that never tipped into saviorhood, because he had learned the cost of imbalance, and he understood now that walking beside someone required restraint as much as courage. Months passed, seasons shifted, and the mountain that had nearly ended them stood silent again, indifferent but no longer haunting. And when Jack Carter finally returned to the site of the old cabin, not to rebuild, but to acknowledge, Emily Harper came with him, the moment solemn but not heavy, a closing of a chapter that had demanded too much already. Jack Carter spoke aloud the name he had once only written, Laura, not as a wound reopened, but as a truth integrated, and Emily Harper stood with him without flinching, understanding that honoring the past did not diminish the present. The dog remained still, attentive but calm, as if recognizing that this place no longer needed guarding, that some battles ended not with victory, but with acceptance. In time, life simplified, not because it grew easier, but because priorities sharpened, and Jack Carter realized that the discipline he had once used to survive war now served a different purpose, protecting something fragile and real rather than abstract and distant. Emily Harper chose to stay close, not out of dependence, but out of alignment. Two lives intersecting not to erase each other's scars, but to make room for them. And when people asked what had happened in the storm, Jack Carter never offered heroics or miracles, only the truth that sometimes survival came down to stopping, to choosing not to look away, to holding on when the mountain decided to move. In the end, there was no grand redemption, no perfect healing, only a steady continuation, shaped by deliberate choices, a former soldier driving familiar roads with a clearer sense of destination, a woman once discarded, now rooted in purpose, and a bond forged not in calm, but in the willingness to stand together when everything else slid away, proving that even after the fiercest winter, life could resume not as it was before, but as something quieter, stronger, and finally shared. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as thunder from the sky or voices from the clouds. Sometimes God works quietly, placing the right soul on the road at the exact moment another can no longer keep walking alone. What saved them that night was not strength, wealth, or certainty, but a simple choice to stop, to care, and to refuse to look away. In our daily lives, we often pray for signs, for answers, for relief from the storms we cannot control. Yet God's answers often come through people, through small acts of compassion, through hands that reach out when the world feels cold and unfair. If this story touched your heart, perhaps it is because you have been there too, carrying pain no one sees, wondering if you still matter. Remember this, you are not forgotten, and even in your darkest winter, God is still working behind the scenes of your life. If you believe in stories of hope, healing, and second chances, please share this message with someone who may need encouragement today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, courage, and quiet miracles. May God bless you, protect you, and remind you that you never walk alone.